Hey guys, just some quick background information. What we've done in the third unit is already learned about a civilization that was very communicative, and they also were very interactive. The Renaissance in Europe was something that was very popular and very famous for its advances. The reason that it advanced is because it was finally a time in Europe when people started interacting again. They started interacting with the Islamic Empire through things like trade, and of course through the Crusades, and they learned a lot from the Islamic Empire. As that happened, the trade started to create a situation where they became smarter by coming into contact with people all over the world. The trade made them also more wealthy. As we learned about in Italy, there was an emergence or a start of this middle class, this merchant class, people that made a lot of money. And so people became smarter, wealthier, more worldly. They became more, their lives became better because they interacted with other civilizations around the globe. The interaction was really what made them great. What you're going to learn about now is China. There was a certain time in Chinese history when Chinese simply closed their doors to all outsiders. They decided not to interact with other civilizations. However, what you're going to find out over the next couple of days in class and outside of class is that this didn't necessarily hurt the Chinese. As a matter of fact, they still succeeded quite a bit. So the question for this unit still remains the same as last unit. Do civilizations need to interact with other civilizations in order to advance? Or are some civilizations okay, and are they actually going to be more prosperous if they don't interact with other civilizations? That's the question we're trying to answer. The dynasties, or the leadership of China, that we're going to talk about mostly in this slideshow is the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasties. Those are the dynasties that actually shut their doors. They finally said, you know what, we're fine. We don't want any contact with Europeans. We don't need to trade with the rest of the world. We're going to just be China, and everybody else can leave us alone. Those are the dynasties that decided to do it. Let's learn a little bit about how the dynasties developed. Alright, so the first dynasty that actually took over control of China, that was a purely Chinese dynasty, was the Ming dynasty. That's probably the most popular dynasty of all time in the Chinese history. What a dynasty is a series of rulers that were all the same family. So you would call it, you would call a dynasty like the Clintons. If Hillary Clinton became the president of the United States, the Clintons would be a dynasty because they had more than one person in the same family that ruled the United States. The Bushes, obviously George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. were both presidents of the United States. That's a dynasty. So the Mings were a dynasty as well. Since 1279, the Mongols under Kublai Khan ruled China as the Yuan dynasty. One of the more dominant figures in history, one of the most dominant civilizations in history is a civilization called the Mongols. The Mongols originated up here above China in Mongolia. The thing was, though, they were not sedentary people. They never stayed in the same place. So what they did was travel around all of Asia, conquering territory. China, Mongolia, the Middle East, over near Russia, and they eventually ventured down into India and conquered part of that territory as well. They were very powerful, and they traveled around, and they would conquer territories, and then they would kind of stay there, maybe leave. They were just not happy settling down. The most popular or famous of the Mongols was Genghis Khan. Most people have heard of him. This was part of his family. His sons and grandsons carried on the Khan tradition. Anyway, in 1368, finally after the Khan dynasty had kind of died down and lost a lot of power, a Chinese peasant named Hong Wu commanded a rebel army that drove the Mongols out of China. Hong Wu became the first emperor of the Ming dynasty. So Hong Wu was the first Ming, and that was in 1368. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the Ming dynasty then. So Hongwu began his rule by increasing food production, improving irrigation, and raising cotton and sugar cane. So as his first priority, he did what a lot of rulers before him and after him did. He concentrated on food production. This does a lot of things for the people that you rule. If you are able to make enough food to go around, well, then you can essentially erase poverty in your kingdom or civilization. If there's enough food to go around, people become fairly happy. And then when they're happy, they're willing to accept you as their ruler. So he really put a lot of effort into putting people to work on farms and making sure that there was plenty of food to go around. He brought back ancient Chinese traditions too. So he returned China to kind of more of like a Chinese state instead of a Mongolian state or something that the Khans did. He restored merit-based civil service examination system, which that did, it gave people, it put the people who were the most qualified in positions of power. So it didn't just put people from his family in power, it put good people in power. It really stabilized the Chinese economy and the Chinese population as well. People were really appreciative of this. Hongwu, however, became a ruthless, untrusting tyrant who put to death many people he suspected of plotting against him. Just like many rulers before him and many rulers after him, you were either with him or against him. So if you weren't with him, you probably had some trouble staying alive or staying in China. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew that what he was doing for China was the right thing, and everybody needed to get on board or get off the boat, so to speak. So, during the Ming Dynasty, China became very powerful. He definitely did a lot to stabilize their society. He also stabilized their military, and they became the most dominant power in Asia during that time. During that time, he made sure that anybody who wasn't Chinese but lived near China and wanted to trade with China, China had a lot of things to offer, made sure that they paid tribute. They were vassal states. In other words, if you wanted to trade with China, you had to give China money, you had to swear loyalty to China, you had to make sure that you were subservient to China. China also expected people far away to pay tribute, which sometimes worked because China had those things that everybody wanted: spices, silk, steel. They had a lot of things that people wanted, so they tried to make the Europeans pay tribute to them as well. This didn't sit well with some European nations because they thought they were better than the Chinese. Some European civilizations were okay with it. So outsiders from distant lands, they considered them a threat to their peace and prosperity. So the Ming Dynasty and Hongwu definitely wanted to make sure that China stayed China. Hongwu's son Yongle continued his policies and moved the royal court to Beijing. This is the first time in Chinese history that you see Beijing as the capital city of China, which of course it is still today. So Yongle had a curiosity about the outside world. He was an adventurer at heart. He decided that he would send voyages then, some of his most trusted captains with large ships, to other areas of the world. This was in 1405, and it happened even before Europeans began a lot of their expeditions. As we know, Columbus discovered America in 1492. Yongle was launching expeditions all over the world in 1405. So the Chinese were very advanced for this time as far as building ships and trading. He wanted to impress the world. He wanted to expand China's tribute system, so not just people around him paying tribute to him. He wanted people all over the world paying tribute to China, and he wanted to make sure that everybody knew China was the best. So what did he do? He built ships. He made sure that he put his best craftsmen to work to build the biggest ships possible to show the power of China. So Chinese Muslim named Zheng He led all 7 voyages. Zheng He was the head of the ship. He was the captain of the ship, and he wanted to he was very trusted by Yongle, and he went out there to bring a bunch of Chinese goods to the world and then make sure that people knew that these goods came from China, and if they wanted more of them, they would need to obviously pay up and pay tribute to China. He distributed the gifts to show Chinese superiority, and more than 16 countries sent tribute back with him to the Ming Dynasty. So it was a very successful voyage. So this did a couple of things. It made Chinese very powerful and very known throughout the world, but it also cost a lot of money for the Chinese government. The ships were humongous, the voyages were expensive, and obviously the resources that they took all over the world were also very expensive. So the Chinese scholarly officials, the people that kind of worked for Yongle, they thought the voyages wasted valuable resources that could be used for Chinese defense against attacks. So after the 7th voyage, China withdrew into isolation. They decided it would be best to just be China. Don't worry about what the rest of the world is doing. Save your money, save your power, and just close your doors to the outside world. This is when China started to become an isolationist nation. Alright, let's talk about what it means for the Ming Dynasty to be isolationist. As far as isolation was concerned, the Ming Dynasty and their government had a couple of things that they wanted to make sure happened. For instance, they wanted to keep outsiders to a minimum. They only wanted Chinese to be in China. They didn't want to trade with the outside world, so they set up a couple rules. They said that only the government was able to conduct foreign trade, and they only allowed that trade to happen through 3 coastal ports around China. So only 3 places on the coast of China was allowed to do any trade, and only government officials were allowed to do the trade. This, however, didn't sit well with Chinese merchants, people that were becoming rich off of trading Chinese goods. In other words, what are they going to do for money if China won't allow them to trade? So obviously the next best thing to do if you are a merchant and you don't feel like changing your job is to start trading illegally. In other words, smuggle goods out of China into the other parts of the world. And that's what happened a lot. So Chinese goods still made it to other parts of the world. It just wasn't legal trade, for instance. So what happened as far as the economy was concerned? It increased the demand for a lot of goods. Whenever you make a good rare or hard to get, typically what happens to the price of that good is it goes up. So what happened? The demand for Chinese goods affected the economy. The silk and ceramics that were so abundant in China that everybody wanted, those industries actually grew. People were willing to pay more money to get that stuff out of China, and they were willing to pay the government for it. So commerce and manufacturing increased as well. You had to make more goods, and you actually had to, allow for more people to buy your goods. So production increased as well. That actually was a good thing for the Chinese economy. That being said, only certain parts of China became industrialized. In other words, they didn't mechanize their whole country. They were still largely a farming country. So they didn't become highly industrialized, but they still increased their trade, and the power and the need of their goods still continued to grow. So what happened as a result of Ming's foreign policies? Missionaries and people that worked for the Catholic Church and other churches, they followed traders into China. They brought with them Christianity and knowledge of European science and technology. Most Chinese, however, just like the Ming Dynasty, opposed the European and Christian presence. They didn't want Europeans in, they didn't want Christianity in. Most of them had nothing to do with it. When Yongle moved the Chinese capital to Beijing, he ordered the building of a great palace complex to symbolize his power and might. It took him 14 years to build it, with red walls 35 feet in height. Those of you who know a little bit of Chinese history or have seen pictures of China, this is the Forbidden City. It is a place where you can go and tour now, but it was the place for all Chinese emperors after Yongle built it. The Ming Dynasty built the Forbidden City, and it is where pictures of Chairman Mao in later years hung from its walls. You can still go see it today. It's an amazing building, actually a complex inside a large wall that used to house all of the royal family of China for many years, other than of course today where it's a tourist site for foreigners and people that were not part of the royal family of China were not allowed to enter the building. Okay, so the Ming Dynasty eventually weakened, like all dynasties do. They had ineffective rulers, they were a little corrupt, and then of course they lost a lot of money, especially with those voyages that they had. So then in order to get the money back, they had to tax their people a little bit more in order to get that money back, which caused a strain on the people. And then after they had a few bad harvests where the people couldn't give up enough of their crops, then eventually the people rebelled against the Ming Dynasty. So the Manchus, which is part of the Manchurian area of China up here, invaded, and the Ming Dynasty collapsed. The Manchus, or the Manchurians, seized Beijing and took the name of Qing Dynasty. So the Ming Dynasty gave way to the Qing Dynasty. Under the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese people did not accept the new rulers because technically they didn't believe that they were Chinese. They weren't pure Chinese. However, the Qing emperors won their support. Just like all new emperors need to do, they need to take steps to make sure that their people love them. So, what did they do? They improved food production, they improved conditions in China, and they preserved Chinese traditions, which was good for the Chinese people that were in China at the time. Kangji and Qianlong were the two most powerful king rulers. They continued this isolationism from the rest of the world. If foreign states wanted to trade with China, they would have to follow Chinese rulers. Trade only at certain ports, just like the Ming Dynasty did, and they paid tribute through the kowtow ritual. What you're seeing here down below in the lower right hand is this ritual of paying tribute to the dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty, just like the Ming Dynasty, would have, foreigners come into their ports, and if the foreigners wanted to trade for silks and pottery and steel and all that stuff, they would need to be able to go to the rulers of the dynasty and get on their knees and bow to them, saying that they are their servants. So again, some people weren't willing to do this. The Dutch were. They were willing to accept the rules and became a good trading partner. The English were too stuck up to do it, so they decided not to. And China said, fine, you're not allowed to trade with us. So the Dutch were really reaping the benefits, and the Dutch became rich because of it. The traders from the Dutch were okay with bowing to the rulers, and therefore they were able to get the silks and everything out of China to trade with. What happened during the Qings? The production of rice in a long period of peace gave people better lives. So they were able to produce more rice, which kept people fed. And they also had a lot of peace by closing their doors to foreigners and outsiders. People were, peaceful. They didn't have a lot of wars, so people were happy. And of course, they were fed, which also made them happy. The nutrition improved, and of course, when people are fed and happy, they make babies. And so the population under the Qing Dynasty really doubled. However, it wasn't great for everybody. Women suffered during this period. Men became valued more over daughters. So many infant girls were killed, and daughters and women had fewer rights than men. Alright, let's recap, guys. There were civilizations that were isolated and civilizations that were interactive. In Unit 2, we learned about isolationist civilizations. One was the Aztecs. They were isolated by geography, and the other was the Middle Ages Europe. They were isolated because of other reasons. They were isolated because of fear. They were isolated because of a lack of education. They were isolated because of lack of health and good medicine. They kind of stayed where they were. That hurt those civilizations inevitably. Even though they both had good, certain parts of their civilization that was good, inevitably when they came into contact with other civilizations like the Aztecs did with the Spanish, it caused them to cause that civilization to end. And then, of course, you had the Islamic Empire that interacted with other civilizations, and it helped them quite a bit. They learned a lot about medicine, food, health, science. They were able to do things like build ships and travel around the world and trade very well. They did very well for themselves because they interacted. Now we're kind of flipping the script on you. We learned about one civilization, the Renaissance Europe, and they interacted with everybody. They learned a lot. They did a lot. And because of that, they had rapid increases in their level of arts and literature and medicine and science. They did very well for themselves. But then you got this other civilization, and this is our wild card. This is why we're bringing them up. They decided at one point as Chinese to be isolationist. They didn't want to deal with the rest of the world, so they shut their doors. All our learning so far would tell us that that's a bad thing and that will end your civilization. But it didn't. It continued. They were successful. They increased production. They made a lot of money from trade. So what's the deal? Does isolationist mean that your civilization is going to fail? Or can a civilization still endure or even flourish if they are isolationist, like the Ming and Qing dynasties of China? I'll leave that for you to determine and think about, but other than that, that's the presentation. I'll see you on Monday, and good luck with those notes. Bye.